Wait, give me a clap real quick. Just no. Thank you guys, but just one for the. Yeah, synchronize the cameras.
Appreciate everyone's enthusiasm. Welcome again to another rendition of the Graffiti Park Ocho class series. I'm here today with our special guest, Pope, who's going to talk to us about Mandala. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Pope.
How's it going, guys?
Hold up, Pope!
So, never had to really give one class before, so I have a step guide for how I make my mandalas, and it's really, people always say, alright, with mandalas, I always hear the thing where people say, oh man, I can't focus on it, or it's too intricate, or, there's always sometimes where you'll hear people say, well, it's too much detail, but really when you start with a mandala, it's one of those things where, in all honesty, you don't do it all at once. That's the best way of looking at it. Like, I like to break it apart bit by bit, just because it is a lot of detail. But it's something to where you can kind of look at the piece, come back to it, look at the piece, come back to it each day, and you kind of just build on it. So the biggest thing that you'll see when you see my mandalas is that I kind of do this thing right there. Excuse me. So this is the sixth step. There's 6 steps to it. Normally, first part is you're going to stencil your outline. And what I mean by stenciling your outline is, it's weird, but I have a very interesting process of doing this. But I take circles and I start doing little layers of circles. So when you see some of my mandalas, you'll see the outline of a circle on there, and then from there I start working inside out. So usually what I'm doing is, what you'll see like these little white lines around some of my mandalas. That's the stencil outline I'm talking about. Everything else tends to be a bit more free-handed, and with that you're more so looking for shapes and sizes that are very much symmetrical or work together. So something like triangles, you want to avoid things like squares, because squares end up looking more diamond-ish. You'll see a lot of times I'll use circles because circles have a very symmetrical to them. Or I'll use right here in this example. I'll have triangle shaped patterns in them. So the second step to that is when you're working inside, particularly with mandalas, just because it's something to where when you work outside in, I found it more difficult in the sense that I start losing space, whereas I can build from the inside and continuously go out and extend the mandala out. So you're more so just I think of it as expanding my ideas instead of closing in. So a lot of times that's why you'll see some with my mandalas, there's this outward look to them. So I'll build outwards with certain types of shapes. Anything that has spikes or certain types of flowers. Alright, yeah, I already did kind of go over step 3 with the shapes. So, different types of shapes that you want to look for. Things that can have that symmetry look to them. Things that can work with a symmetrical type of repeating pattern more than anything else. Most recently I did one where it was the Canadian flag as a center, and something for me that helps is usually once I get to the center of my mandalas, I tend to have this little, I have a little bit of difficulty with what type of shape or what type of pattern I put. I always end up going with something that's almost like a cross shape, just because you can divide it into different sections that way. You can see with this mandala, I have it split 4 ways, and this one is almost done in the same way. I have it sectioned off, and then from there, what I'll do is I'll start from one section outwardly, and then build. I'll start with one section outwardly, like this, and then I'll add a second layer, and then what I found is important, it's an anchor. Every mandala for me has like a shape that's a certain anchor that goes around the entire piece. So you can tell with this one, my anchor was this outside circle. And I didn't really do much. Sometimes what I'll do is, if I work outside like this, I won't always have a pattern that touches, in a sense. So what I mean is that the anchor for this one, they're all connected to each other. And then there are little symbols and shapes that I put on the outside. And then I worked my way back in like this. Whereas with this one, my anchor was on the outside, or was much more closer to the edges. And since I didn't really have a set design in mind, I decided to go with a pattern or a shape that would be a little more fitting to it. So when you're looking at your shapes, think about shapes that kind of complement each other, or different types of symbols that would complement each other. I wish I could have brought another mandala with me. That way you guys could have seen another one. When it comes to detail is just going to be all the little small lines and little small marks and things like that. So things like little shapes, little circular patterns, really with those, it's really up to your own type of creativity. Think of it as you're painting a mask and you're putting the little small finer details into the mask. Even with ones like these, I just put random shapes, random little, what's that word? Not shapes. Would it be lines?
Like patterns?
Patterns, that's the word. Yeah, you would put different types of patterns in them. And I don't always go for them having to be exactly, like looking really, really the same. Because even if you notice with these, there are certain sizes or there are certain shapes or patterns that just will fit on one, but will look a little bit skinnier on another. Like right here. And once you start stepping back, that's the thing about mandalas, is that once you start stepping back and looking at your pieces, you start seeing those little small little details, and you're like, I could have fixed this, or I could have worked on that. So I should have went through.
That's okay.
But I did all of that, but we're gonna go through it again. Making sure you have the stencil outline for each circle of your reference. Usually what I mean by a stencil is when I'll go around my house and I'll find things that are circular pattern or circular shape, like your flask, for example. I'll put the flask as a center. And then after that, I might find a pot and I'll put that, just because it's difficult. It's not easy to find like those,
Circle compass.
yeah, those compasses.
Perfect circle.
Yeah, it's hard to find those. So I'll walk around my house and look for like a shape to it, and I'll just start. Usually what helps me is I start outside, so I'll do the stencil on the outside, and then I'll do the stencil, the next level of the stencil. And you want to have a little bit of space in between them, just because that's what you're going to be creating your patterns based off of. Like when you see this mandala, for example, I'm going and I'm doing my patterns on this line. And then I'm going and I'm doing the next pattern on that same line, if that makes sense. And usually it's about 8 to 10 on average. Like even when you see this mandala right here, there's this layer, then another layer that they build onto it. And then right here, there's a little invisible layer that goes around. And so you're making basically rings. That's the word. I was trying to find it. Rings. You're making rings on your piece. And then you're building off of those rings. All right. I knew the word. I just couldn't find it.
How do you find the exact center? Like, I know that sounds kind of simple, but what is your?
For these?
Yeah.
Usually what I'll do is I like to make I'll do like a little chalk string technique. And so it's something that I actually learned, I saw, it was on a YouTube video where the guy kind of eyeballed it. So there's a little bit of looking at the circular piece and trying to find the center of it. And of course, it's not always going to be perfect, but you want to try to center your eye right where you think the middle of the circle is going to be. And sometimes it works out. There are some times where it doesn't work out, but what you'll start to notice is when you don't see, or when you see the pattern, or you see the ring starting to drift off a little, that's how you know that you're off balance. So what I mean by that is, I'll do, let's say for example, I have a larger size, or I have like a flask. I'll put a ring right here, and then I'll get a smaller circular item, and I'll put a ring there, and then I'll keep working until I find basically something that's almost about the size of your Izzy.
Okay.
I'll use that as a can, and that will be my smallest ring. And so from there, I can look and say, okay, all of my other outside rings are matching. There's no real, they're not offset in a sense. And so once I know that they're not offset, I can continue working. So I usually try to get at least my first 4 layers down, my first 4 rings down. And from there, I'll see, okay, are those rings a little off-centered, or are they tilting to the left or tilting to the right? Because that's really important, because that's what makes your mandala go from looking symmetrical to having that kind of, that, I call it the
spiral look.
Yeah, the spiral look. And that's what you want to avoid, is having the spiral look. So I try to make sure that each time I do it, I'll say, okay, well, maybe I adjust it a little bit, or maybe I'll adjust that ring a little bit to the left or to the right. So finding those, like the outer rings, are the most important thing, and then working your way to the center.
So when you're making your stencils, do you also like draw out lines to divide out like sections of it, or?
On some of them, yes. On some of them, I do, just because it helps with, like this one, for example. I drew out sections, and I built my mandala based off of those sections, just because it's easier for me to do certain types of patterns that way. Like this is definitely one where I would have had to need those sections, just because I'm using those chalked off sections to draw. I'm drawing on those chalked off sections.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's moments where I will freehand it or freestyle it, and with those, it's you can definitely tell the difference, just because this is something that I did with a pattern in mind, but then right here I kind of just had my own thoughts of what I was going to do there.
Gotcha. Do you determine, like, because there's a certain number of pieces you have at the end, like, do you, when you start your layout, when you stencil your layout, do you consider that, like how many you want at the end or anything like that?
No.
Or is it more of just kind of where it takes you?
It's where it takes me.
Okay.
And I definitely have some pieces where that I've caught that, where I'll look at a piece and it won't have the set number, and I'll think to myself, oh man, it's already too late. So if I'm committed, if I'm fully committed to the piece at that point, then I will continue on, and I'll try to make like a little adjustment. If not, then I'll totally start over again. If it looks like it's something to where I know that the piece is going to be noticeable and it's going to bug me, then I'll definitely just start over. That way I can just have that little bit of balance to it.
Gotcha.
And let's see. Like I said, it's best to start inside and then work your way out. And what I mean by that is not so much of the stenciling, but it's more so once you get your stencil down, it's better to start with your inner pattern and then continuously build. That way you don't feel as if your mandala is going to get compressed, because once you start building outwards, for me, what I've noticed is that I've had a difficulty with keeping things balanced in that sense, or keeping them in the same type of shape. So when I work from that inside out, I'm able to kind of control each layer in that sense. Step 3 is using a basic symmetrical shape. So what I mean by basic symmetrical shape is, let's go with a triangle, for example. You can see triangles on these pieces. And right here, for example, these are all triangles. It almost has like that starburst, not the fruit, but like, or not the, the candy, but it has that burst effect to it because I put a star there. Whereas this one, my shape is going to be the circles. That was the first layer that I did on this one, was using the circles, and then because I had the circles there, I started thinking to myself, well, what can I do to these circles? And so, oddly enough, I was actually playing God of War when I came up with the inspiration for this one, just because there's a design of they call it the world-leading snake, or Ouroboros or something like that. And so, yeah, the idea for this one was, why not make the patterns, why not make the circles into two snakes that are kind of like coiled into each other. And so there's one that has the cross hatches. I didn't know if I wanted to go on the cross hatch, so I left it just because I wanted to give it that much more of a difference to it. I felt as if I gave it the same kind of cross hatch pattern, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between them as much. Not only, well, that, but there's also other shapes that are used. You're gonna be very friendly with things like moons, or what's another shape that I use quite often? So, you can use squares, but what I found is that depending on the layer that you're on with your piece, different shapes work differently. For example, this would be great as a square. I use a square as a basis for this mandala, for the center right here. So if I did a square, then that changes the shape of the mandala, that changes the design of that. So if I did something where it was a rectangle, and if I did a rectangle this way, then I want to do a rectangle the other way, just so I make it cross-line. And then from there, since it's cross-line, I'd start this. So when we start adding layers to each circle, it's when we start doing little thin patterns like this on the inside, little lines. And the lines are really just anything that you can think of that would look. I keep saying what's symmetrical. I feel like I'm getting this. Proportion. That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. I want to make sure that it's proportion. Thanks. But that's gonna be the most important thing when it comes to your details. Is that make sure that's proportioned in the sense that if you do design right here, will that design work on each section of your mandala? So for this one, I made sure that each design is gonna have the same type of proportions to it. And sometimes it's not always going to be perfect. So yeah, for example, right here on this section, this piece, this section, and the crown isn't as proportionate as these three are, just because I ran out of space. So it's okay if you have little mistakes, little details like that aren't all the same, but it's important that little smaller details, like if you put an eyeball on one side, make sure that there's an eyeball on the other side. Or when you put certain patterns one way, you want to make sure that that pattern will fit into each shape. So when I put something like these patterns into each one of my floral designs right here, you want to make sure that they can all have that same pattern. you start doing that, you start really thinking of the color thing, right? So what colors can complement each other well, right? Or colors that don't complement each other well, and seeing how that looks like. So I've done mandalas where one color was red, and then I hate using it, but I call it the McDonald's palette, where it's like I actively avoid using red and yellow together because I'm like, I immediately think McDonald's, and I was like, oh man, I don't know what other color I can put with it. Let me just throw some purple in it. And now it's like, all right, now it's McDonald's, but it's also the purple guy that's there too, you know? So it's just like, it gets more fun and more interesting once you just start playing around with the colors like that. And then you can just add the finishing touches. So this is the one that you see right here. That's this mandala. This is a larger size mandala that I have. I had a little accent with
That's crazy.
I had a paint can burst on me. So those are inside my home right now. But when you start looking at things like this, the finishing touches, and what I mean by finishing touches are gonna be the little small things where when you're looking at your mandala, just take a step back. And this is usually, you can start to sense when you're in the finishing touches of it, because it's weird to say it this way, but the mandala speaks to you. It's like, all right, there's enough. We have enough detail going on. You know, you don't have to do any more, right? And so with that, what I start doing is saying, all right, well, what am I missing? Is there anything that I can put as like another layer of gold, or is there a little small pattern or design I can put into it? And finishing touches are the part where when everyone says I do a lot of detail, that this is where it comes into play. The first couple of steps 1 through 5 are really just getting the shapes and stuff down. Step 6 takes the longest, just because you're gonna be looking at your piece and saying, well, what can I add here? Or what can I put on there? And at that point, you kind of take a step back from it. Like for this one, for example, my step 6 was me doing the details on the shark, and then doing the little small line work right here. I left the center alone, just because if you can see right here, this is what happens, and this is what I mean when I say you want to work in a certain type of way, because with this mandala, I worked inside out, or outside in, and because of that, you can see that my pattern on the inside doesn't really have the same level of symmetry as the rest of the mandala. Whereas if I started from my inside out, I could have built more, particularly on the center, which for me, I looked at it and I was like, I'm okay with what I did. I accept it. I like it. I could have done a better design on it. But because I ran out of space, and that's what you want to avoid, is running out of space when you're doing these. Because once you start working this way, you're gonna find that, all right, well, what am I gonna do right here? Whereas with one like this, I can say, all right, I have this piece, or I have this piece, let me start working my way out. And a little bit more when it comes to finishing touches. For me, it's, when I do my finishing touches, I'm stepping away from my piece for about a week and a half. You know, I'm doing other projects, I'm doing other things, just because at that point, you step away from it. And for me, I like, you know, bugs are a big inspiration. Nature is a big inspiration for me. So you can see in some of my pieces where I get where those shapes come out. Like in this one, you can see that there's clearly a shark that I made. But then after that, on this one, this is more of a bug that I was inspired by. And so looking at little, I like to think of it as side quests, because you leave your piece, and then you come back to it with a fresh set of eyes, and you're like, you know what, I saw this pattern, or I saw this detail that I want to put on my mandala. So it's still in the back of your head, but at the same time, you're like, all right, oh, you see, I mean, for example, for me, there was a day when I was on the bus, and the spokes on the bus were inspiration for me to do a piece just because I didn't know what to put on there, and I just started seeing the inside spinners. I was like, that's really cool. They put a hexagon inside of a triangle, you know, and so I went back home and I just I would carry like a little sketchbook of sorts, like a sketchbook of designs, and I would just see a design that I really liked and say, all right, let me see if that design or if that pattern can work. So there's a bit of you're looking for patterns. Oh, sorry. You're looking for patterns in nature. You're looking for patterns on the outside. Just looking for inspiration. That's the best way of looking at it. So for me, my mandalas don't just come from my mind. They also come from where I was or where I've been to. So this one was really amazing for me. This one I really enjoyed just because it was when I went down to Mexico, or when I was living in Mexico, and I went on a boat, but there was also, I could see like fishes and things like that, and so I based a lot of it on, I had a theme for this one. So you see a lot of the ocean based into it. So whether it's the sharks or the sea angels, or even the little sea trilobites in the middle, and then down to the seashells. So I have a seashell-like pattern onto it.
That's dope.
Thank you.
That is pretty sick.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I was talking too much or too little.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
For like, so obviously there's significant detail on that one, and then that one's also insanely detailed until you see that big one, and it's really detailed. With trying to get repeating symmetry, do you pencil it in sometimes? Because I imagine if I like go to use like a pen, like a marker, that I'd probably mess up the symmetry.
I use a chalk marker.
I
use a chalk pencil, and if I don't think it's gonna work, what I'll do is I'll take like a chalk, because everything is, I always use a black background with the exception of this one. But chalk markers or chalk pencils work great just because you can do the little sketch of the outline, and then you can go over it with the paint pen, and nobody's gonna know the difference. So nobody can really see that little white chalk out. Like even on these, you can kind of see it, but with chalk, it's one of those things where you want to have the design confirmed in your mind, because once you put it onto the canvas, chalk I found is a little tricky to get off of. Like when it comes to, like if you do a little light layer, just like stencil it real light, then you don't have a problem. But if you're actually trying to go in there, then it's gonna have difficulty with it. But yeah, I've had moments where I do, I won't do chalk, and I'll just freestyle it off the top of my head, and I'll think, you know what, I think that pattern will work well. And the thing is that once you put it on there, you have to commit. That's the thing when you freehand it, or when you do it without an outline, whatever design that you put on there, you have to commit to it. So if I put like a little mark on one side, I'm like, all right, great. Now they all have to have that mark, right? And so that's where the dedication of the process comes into it. The interesting thing about these, the larger ones I plan out a bit more, whereas the smaller ones are a lot more free-handed. I'll just have an idea on the top of my head, and I'll just put the design on there first, and I'll do, like what I do is I'll just do that initial stencil, I'll do that initial design, and I'll leave it like that. And I try to give myself, when it comes to my smaller mandalas, I like to give myself, because of practice, about a week's time to do them. Just because for me, I feel like that's enough time for me to be able to do a full complete mandala. Whereas with the larger ones, usually anywhere from 3 to 6 months. That's touching them on again, off again.
How big is the bigger ones that you do?
That one is, I have 16 inch, and then 24. And then I think the largest one I've done so far was at Graffiti Park.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that was the first one that I did was there, and that one for me was doing a mandala that size, and just be able to step back and realizing once you start doing larger scales once you have a larger canvas, detail is really something that's it's emphasized a bit more in a sense. And it's also just looking at what you want to fill in, because you have a lot of space, and that's the thing when it comes to larger canvases. You have a lot of space, so you have to fill them with something. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it's weird. It'd be weird if I just did a mandala that's this size, but all you see is just the center, right? So you have this entire layer of black. Even for ones like this, it took me a minute just to get used to just saying, all right, just that's where it's at, that's where it's at. I don't have to do anything else. But just giving yourself that space and knowing, all right, this is where I stop, helps out.
So you don't really plan the negative space, because you said the mandala kind of like you feel the energy or it's an exchange or whatever, so you kind of know when to stop. So is it like you see or feel balance?
Yeah.
Like with the space a little bit, they run with it?
Yeah, I definitely, for me, it's about seeing, it's really about feeling that type of balance of like, is it equal on each side, or am I doing enough on one side? Because sometimes you don't want to, I found anytime that I've tried to overdo a piece or over detail a piece, it's never looked good. Once you start looking at it and saying, once you start really racking your brain, I feel as if once you start really feeling that pain of, oh man, I gotta get something on there, and you know that the piece is complete, just stop right there. Because whatever you're gonna do next to it, it's probably gonna ruin it. And I don't mean that in like a bad way, but it's like, you have it set in how you look, and now you're just finding the comfort in saying, all right, I'm done. Because with mandalas, you really can go, you can really just go nonstop on them. You can really do as much detail as you want. But then what is it that you're looking at as the end result? Because I could just do a bunch of layers and a bunch of dots and designs on there, but I find it more interesting when you look at a piece and you can kind of separate them, and you can see like, all right, I see a little face, or I see a creature. I mean, there was one lady, she told me that she saw Darth Vader in one of my pictures. So it's like, you unintentionally, you create these shapes that you don't realize, you create these patterns that you don't realize, that somebody else says something, and you're just like, huh, I never saw that. Right? And that's really the fun part about it, is that you almost kind of make it a search, because every time I've done, or for every piece I've done, some people have told me, every person has told me something different about what they've seen. And that for me is the great thing about it, is that each person can tell me what is it that they're, because you get to see what's on that person's mind, right? Like if I didn't point out that there's sharks in this piece, what would be the first thing that would have came to some people's minds? I know one lady, with this piece, she was like, I see a bunch of bugs and insects, but on this layer I kind of have these like bug-like pincers on them. So she was ignoring everything else and she was focusing on it.
No, it's dope. Those are great. Yeah, they're amazing.
And I go, I think, yeah, when it comes to those larger mandalas, to me, it's okay to play with light. I found that it's okay, it's more fun to play with color, because then you're adding another layer to it. Color in and of itself is another layer to it. Just because you can play around with different types of shape, like I said, shapes and shades. Like, you do the same type of work as you do. It's just like you have these patterns that are in there. You have certain colors that are in there. But they work really well. They complement well with each other.
You know, something that I didn't find about color is they all match, dude.
Yeah.
You just gotta figure out a way to match it, you know?
Right. So, does anybody have any questions for me?
Where do you as an artist where you normally like you end up just doing it like this, or bigger?
Um,
Have you used like other mediums besides this?
I've used difficult to say just because I don't. It's pricey. That's the best way to look at it. And so the person who's selling it, that is buying it, ends up paying more for the frame than they do the actual piece. Just because I've gone to like Mandala's or other framing shops and like you have to see just because you have to make custom frames for them.
Not just the frame, the glass too.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an entire process of just having to get these types of frames. I've used for the larger wood panels. This is a secret. Don't tell anybody because if they find out about this, they're gonna know the price. But I go to Lowe's or I go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and Harbor Freight is also another method that they might have. But they sell larger circular panels there, and they sell them as like wood table panels. You can get them for about, these are usually about $7 to $8. The larger panels are about $10 to $12. Now, if you go to your local art store, you're gonna spend about 3 times. Like I've gone to Licks and got these and tried to get all of these circular mandalas, the circular canvases. They're like $25.
Yeah,
And that's why I'm
even
like,
like
no.
the triangle ones.
Yeah,
like
even the
oval
triangle ones. It's better just
More
to go.
expensive, it's wood sheet.
Yeah, it is.
It's better. It's
And
better.
they're smaller
if you're
than like
working with
bigger
wood,
canvases.
Just go because I work on wood. It's better just to go to the wood shops and buy it from there, just because you're not paying as much. So now you guys know my secret. The smaller ones.
Don't
I
tell
do.
nobody we're being recorded right now.
Bob, the whole world's just watching a live stream. I'll be afraid to tell mine right now.
If you want to know, you gotta subscribe.
Yeah, that's redacted.
Yeah.
No, it's for the smaller ones. I go to I'll usually go to so 3 months for about 8 months. Oh, it's important that before you do anything with them that you have to sand them, because if you don't sand them, what you're gonna realize is when you're painting over it, you have these little bumps. So, because wood it's fine details, so anything that you're using holds a paint. So any fine detail that you need, like a little bump or something like that, can cause a surprise. So you want to make sure that you sand it. Then after you sand it, I put it's a sealant. I put a sealant on there, and then I put.
That's my next question. Like, do you prime it or do you?
I prime it, I seal it, and then I paint over it with black. And I like to do 2 layers because you want to avoid. Don't use a paintbrush. Use a roller because what I found is that when I use a paintbrush, the brush has these little streaks on it. So you're gonna be drawing on those streaks. So you're gonna be writing on those streaks, and that's what dries out. So you get the filter. If you use a roller, the roller smooths out the paint, smooths out the paint, so that it doesn't have that markings.
Are those wood panels or canvases?
They're wood panels.
Okay.
Alrighty, thank you, Pope.
Yeah.
Fun time. And if you're still with us, you can find Pope at Spider in the Rose Garden Studios on Instagram, and you can find us at graffitipark_LV on all of our stuff. Thank you all for being here.
Yay!